Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi John Spira-Savett,
And I'm Rabbi Dr. Karen Reiss Medwed.
and this is a conversation for Adar of 5784. It is March 17th, about a week before Purim. It's day 164 of the war. And well, some of the things that we want to talk about, we might talk about if it were any year. We're kind of being motivated and looking at this particularly by what's been going on these past months. And so if you're listening to this and it's after, maybe God willing, some amazingly good things have happened, or maybe this speaks particularly to the moment we're in. But Karen, where do you we should tell people where we each do our rabbiing out of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I am what I would call an avocational rabbi. Don't get paid to do my rabbiing, but I'm very active in the Rabbinical Assembly of the Conservative Movement and in our RA. I'm about to step onto the Executive Council, and I write Gittin. I write the Jewish divorce writs, and I'm going to be sitting on the CJLS, the Law Committee. I also have been working to support the movement through our response to the war against Israel and the attacks of October 7th. And so have been deeply engaged in that space, rather thankfully, because it has given me a space where I can really invest in being able to think about that, respond to it, talk to colleagues about it.
Yeah.
And otherwise, just in my other hat, so people know, I'm a teaching professor retiring early from Northeastern University right now.
Mm. And I'm a congregational rabbi right now, primarily. Our synagogue is called Temple Beth Abraham. I'm in Nashua, New Hampshire, and so that's my primary base of operations. It's possible that some people may have found this via one other thing that I have done recently, which is to co-host a podcast called Tov, which Hebrew for good, which is connecting the TV show The Good Place to various issues in Jewish ethics. And I should say that we are connecting and reconnecting, the two of us. We were classmates at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We were ordained as rabbis at the same time, although we don't really connect a lot with each other. And it's really through particular things, and actually through Karen, your initiatives through the Rabbinical Assembly that got us onto this conversation. And I'm grateful for what you've been doing for particularly for us rabbis, all of us, not only in the United States and North America, but in Israel too.
Though I will say for everyone, just because I think it's always helpful to have that personal side of things, we also had a slight connection through Nashua, because my youngest son is a member of the Spartans Drum and Bugle Corps, which plays out of Nashua. So we drive up from Long Island during the year for the weekend camps before Spartans hit the road. And so I spent a lot of time in the Nashua middle school and high school over the last 2 years, getting to know the community as we've been around for rehearsals. So that's also been an interesting little intersection of reconnecting and getting to know the richness of the music life in particular that Nashua has to offer.
Yeah, and while I knew some of this through my kids' involvement in youth music and theater, I actually didn't know anything about this until you came along. Is that the trombone that you said we might be hearing in the background a little bit?
He's a trombonist, although he does baritone. He's with the Barrys for Spartans when he marches.
So each of us have a connection to this particular moment that's I'm sure unique, and to Purim. And actually what got us connected around this, I don't know, a couple of months ago or so, was a sense among a lot of rabbis and a lot of leaders of Jewish communities that Purim was going to be hard this year, hard to celebrate and be joyful at a time, particularly, I want to say, thinking about hostages and families of hostages, but all the fighting, and also and thinking about how Purim is usually a celebration in which we look back on those things because they're over, or they're in our past, or even if something recent has happened, it's in our past. And a lot of us have been expressing a sense that on the one hand, the joy of Purim is hard to have, while the story of Purim, as we'll talk about, actually might have a lot to say to us on a quote unquote serious, or not even quote unquote, on an actually serious level. Are you still feeling the kind of joy, difficulty right now as you look ahead next week to Purim?
I'm definitely feeling the tension around, masquerading in costumes and that kind of sense of how can I feel frivolous when there's so much pain and angst. One of the benefits of doing the deep dives, I think, is um, feeling less alone about it. I think so many of us are feeling this way, and the resources have begun sprouting up. One place that I zoomed in on that was incredibly helpful was Yad Vashem, putting up resources of what Purim celebrations looked like during the Shoah.
Mm,
And that was really a remarkable moment of really deep humility to recognize that whatever it is we're going through, proportionate to what they must have been experiencing, and being able to see this archaeological, these pieces, these real um, treasures, including a Megillat Esther and chapter 9, which I'm sure we'll dive into, having the names Hitler and Mussolini listed alongside the names of Haman's sons, and beginning to reflect on others have done this before us.
mm.
And how interesting to dig into recent history and learn from them also what we can do.
Yeah, and I'm really hoping, and I hope that we will talk about that some, because I feel like I know that, and I don't know why it's been so hard for me to access that. Why in some sense this feels like an unprecedented thing, even though in Jewish history almost nothing really is. I was going to say that, so you and I were for a semester at Chavruta. We were Talmud study partners when we were studying in Israel, and we had a third, Valerie Stessin, who
Mhm.
was our other member. And one of the things that I know about you is that you were the classmate with the best Israeli type Hebrew accent, and I can't remember why you have that.
Yeah, because I grew up in Beersheba. And so actually, right, all these events of the South, that's my home. And we call him my stepdad. He's not quite old enough to really be a stepdad, but my father's widower after 30 plus years of partnership and then marriage. Their kibbutz is just a few miles north of Sderot, and he was down with the family that day. So this really is, when we talk about this hits home and everyone has their people, our people are there. Our
Mm,
family's
mm,
people
mm.
were there that day, and I've been living through this mamach day by day, and Asher's in Ashdod in the apartments, and so also for the last 17 years, this, the so-called quiet ceasefire. People in the South will always be the first to remind everybody that there's never been a break from the rockets. So yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I have cousins, actually, who I've reconnected with even before October 7th, was beginning to reconnect with more. They don't live right in the South, but I've certainly had family members, and then mostly friends from college whose kids have been serving in Gaza, and also around here. Interestingly, in New Hampshire, again of all places, meeting actually Palestinians, a handful of people who have family both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and who've been, and who've lost people for this too. So there's a lot of those
There's a
connections.
lot. And I
And
will say I'm in Plainview now. And so we have our own local hero, Omer Nutra, and his parents have been incredible advocates and are waiting 160 plus days now to get their son out of Gaza. He was captured, and they've seen video of him being taken alive across into Gaza and have had no word since. And they have made it their daily mission, no matter where they're at, to make sure that we don't forget those hostages that are still waiting to come home. And so that's a huge part of this as well.
yeah,
The
yeah,
That feeling of helplessness, and how do we all band together to get them home swiftly.
yeah. I have a one more degree removed connection to him as well, since I used to teach in that community and at that school that his family's been a part of too. And really, I think for both of us, for a lot of our colleagues, we've just been constantly lifting up in all of our learning and dedicating these conversations to all of the people who are still captive, and hoping that by our conversations and the ones that they spark by people listening to us, that will somehow, generate something of this wisdom, Torah wisdom, that will make itself to a change. So, what we thought is that we would talk about the Megillah from kind of this dimension, first of all, of what we could call anti-Semitism and the response to it. The Megillah is so interesting as a text about Jews in the diaspora facing something that well, I guess we'll talk about, layer by layer. We call it anti-Semitism. It's anachronistic to use that word, but I think just convenient to do that right now. And shall we do that? Should we kind of like traipse a bit through the Megillah and
Yeah,
touch on some of these points and see where that
yeah.
and
Before we jump into the like line by line specifics, I was reflecting actually this last week, and you just kind of alluded to it, but I wanted to make this a little bit bolder. We talk a lot about Megillah Esther as being one of the only books in which God is not mentioned, and that's for a lot of rabbis and teachers become a thing. But I actually think we forget and neglect to mention it's our only Jewish book,
Mm,
right? Everywhere else, every other holiday is about the formation of Jews. It's about us becoming from biblical into rabbinic Judaism, our liberation from Egypt, our wandering in the desert, our receiving of this notion of the study of Torah. Even the Maccabees were kind of still in formation with the destruction of the temple. The Book of Esther, we self-identify as Jews.
mm.
And it is the only book in which the theme is, how do you deal with people who hate not just the emergent biblical inter-rabbinics who we were on our journeys of Amalek, but quite literally, how do you deal with people who hate the Jewish community in the diaspora?
Mm.
And I presume we haven't really named that a lot, at least in the last 25 years, because that hasn't been our lived experience. But I think that's a good slice for us sitting stateside, sitting in North America, of thinking about this text differently. It's our only
Yeah.
text that has nothing agricultural and nothing connected to the land of Israel. It's just about us.
That is really interesting. Yeah, that is super interesting, because I've been thinking that it is a story that's at least set in a time when Jews live in this imperial reality that dominates at least the Middle East, and actually even beyond this Persian Median Empire, and where there's, I think, an understanding that probably the original readers would have seen this. Well, it's in Hebrew, so it would have maybe been read by Jews who knew Hebrew, maybe even who lived in Eretz Israel, but also that it would have happened after Jews were allowed to be in Israel. So these would be Jews who chose not to be, and who live in a diaspora for some reason, and the many layers of their reality. So unlike some of the other books, as you're saying, of the Bible, or most of them or all of them, where we are a nation attached to a land, and when we're attacked, it's only because of being in the land, or somehow in that identification. Here they're Jews with a reality that's more diffuse and dispersed. It's interesting.
It's
So
interesting. And it's the only book where we don't yearn to go back to Jerusalem at the end of it.
yeah.
She doesn't say, let's escape this king and mass return to the land of Israel that our heart has been yearning for, which is sort of the Book of Lamentations gets us back there. Even the Song of Songs kind of ends with this allusion to that. It's really fascinating that we don't hear of Jerusalem. We don't hear of self-sovereignty. We hear about the struggle. We hear about the ability to hide our identities, to choose which parts of our identities we reveal at what times. Very current, very current.
Yeah, and that's really one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it too, is because I think the questions of anti-Semitism, of hate, are in the book, as well as the self-definition things, the things that aren't, and those things are always intertwined, but which thing leads first. And so I it's interesting. My first real deep dive myself into the Book of Esther was when I was in college, and I came back from Israel actually in a U.S. presidential year, which was 1988, after a year there. And what sort of got me thinking about this was the fact that the one of the nominees for president at the time, Governor Michael Dukakis, was married to a Jewish woman, and there was a fair amount of commentary in the Jewish community about this. And I was sort of surprised that they didn't talk about this. Sounds a lot like King Achashverosh and Queen Esther, and why isn't anybody working that angle? And it sort of sent me into a thing. And I wrote my first article about that in I guess would have been that year or right after, so 88 or 89. And one of the things that I thought about in the first chapter is that you could read the first whole chapter. And I should say, so if you are, well, you would have to be listening to this after, since no one's watching us Zoom right now. You could look up the text of Megillah Esther, the Book of Esther, in whatever text you have, or on safaria.org, which we'll post in the notes. But the first chapter of the book does not give any indication that it is a book that has anything to do with Jews. There's no mention of us. I mean, actually, but basically on the surface, it is written in Hebrew, but there's a lot of things that are just strange about the book. It is really, I don't. There are some books in the latter parts of the Bible I don't know well, but I think of this as a book that's really defines the situation without any reference to Jews, and which I think is which could be totally benign, or it could be an erasure kind of thing, an experience that the composers were articulating. There is one thing which in the maybe there's more than one thing, but in the Midrash there is this one hint that is sort of injected in. It has to do with the vessels, where there's this huge party. We're going to sort of assume that people are slightly familiar with the story, but you can take a break and read it if otherwise. But that there was this big 6-month drinking party for King Achashverosh on his coronation, I guess. Is that right? And in chapter 7 of the first chapter, it talks about the vessels they drink with, and there's a midrash that says some of these were like the stolen from the temple in Jerusalem when the first temple was destroyed, which gives it a slightly sinister, I guess, vibe or something. But
or if we get to the end, but maybe it's a foreshadowing, right? It's okay that we hurt them the way we did, because look at how much they had stolen from us. They were really the bad guys to begin with. So there are those who kind of claim that there's some literary seeding to justify some of our ethical behaviors, or unethical, depending on your perspective, at the end of the book.
Yeah, which we do, which is absolutely right. Yeah, that is really good. And I don't know,
one of the things about me also is I'm a huge Disney fan, and spent a lot of time, kind of while I was getting my doctorate in education, thinking about how we teach stories, both midrash but also children's fiction. And there's something about chapter 1 in the Book of Esther that's very much like fairy tales, right? That the first 5 minutes of the movie, you don't really see the princess. You just see the context. So if you think of Cinderella, right, you know that there's something going on with the prince and his father, and needing to get him a wife, and what's going to be, and setting up for this big ball, and the search is on for an escort for him to that ball, before you really encounter the princess. And I wonder, I have no expertise in this, but I wonder if in other kind of fictional literature, this idea that first chapter opens up with setting the scene might be some kind of common motif that's being adapted into this Book of Esther as well.
Wow.
Some foreshadowing.
Yeah, both those things you said, I really, I'm eager to see if we can weave that back. It's making me think about how the Torah itself, of course, does not have Jews or the specific ancestors of the Jews till quite along in as well. And I think when we think about the Torah, we think that the appearance of Avraham and Sarai is meant to be kind of a tikkun. Something's missing in the world, and maybe I don't know. Maybe that's the more positive way to think about chapter 1 of the Megillah. Is okay. There's this world, and it's really it's quite old and imperial, and a lot of nations, 127 apparently, and who are in this one empire, and yet there's this group who are not at least they're there, but they're not, we're not noticed yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously in the second chapter is when we meet, when we meet our characters, our heroes, I guess, Esther and Mordechai, and we learn these couple of things about them. We learn in the case of Mordechai about his, I guess, his identification as an exile, particularly. And it's our tradition to read those verses in chapter 2 in the voicing of the book of Eicha, of Lamentations, and echo that. It's told by the narrator, really. It's not told from Mordechai's perspective at that point. And then we later get this thing that, at least in he is for some reason protective of his cousin, that he doesn't want her identity as a Jew, as someone of Jewish lineage, to be known. Do you take that as a hiding thing, or as a I mean, do you take that in any particular way?
So, there's two interesting, I think, things going on, right? First of all, there's her name game, and there's that hiding piece of what name do you go by. And then there's the identity piece. And I've always thought that the identity piece was the way that we all can kind of turn on and off certain identities depending on our context. In recent years, we've talked a lot about identification versus identity, or having an identity according to whatever your situation is that you're in. Whereas in her name, to me, is really interesting. And she has this name Hadassah, she has this name Esther Bat Avichail, which makes it seem like that's actually her Hebrew name. And maybe Hadassah is a different name, but she seems to move between her names as well. I never have understood quite the relationship of her names to Mordechai. Is one of those names her name and her relationship to Mordechai versus her biological name, perhaps? And while it's clear that he is a refugee, she doesn't seem to be a refugee. It's only about Mordechai that is part of the theme of his story. And so I always wonder if it's her anxiety or if it's his anxiety that she's hiding. Was she comfortable navigating that space? And was she comfortable moving in and out of her different identities? Code switching might be the way that we would talk about that. And is he not comfortable with her doing that? And that's why he's anxious about her.
That's interesting. Wow. She has two names. She has her Hebrew name and her Persian name, apparently. And he, I guess, doesn't. He just has it, or at least we don't know it. He's just Mordechai. Yeah.
He's just Mordechai, and he's not willing to give up his old world rituals.
You see him as not willing to. You see that?
So he is resistant, and that's what gets him in trouble. Now, post October 7th, do I see it the same way? It's really the challenge.
Do you? I mean, at this point in the story,
I feel like I get stuck on that. Like, maybe now I have more respect for Mordechai, whereas before I might have been cynical that he brought a lot of this on. And now I think, oh, look at him, good for him. He's stuck with it.
I think about the fact that if the only thing we know about him is that he apparently is known as Mordechai HaYehudi, as Mordechai the Jew. He doesn't seem to hide that, but really the only thing we know affirmatively about him, well, I shouldn't say the only thing, but what I see that we know about him from the text in chapter 2 is this exile history, and the way that this word exile is repeated really several times in the verse that introduces him in verse 6. And my cynicism has been to say, like, this is all he's got. Like, he doesn't have a substantive Judaism. He's a guy who's constantly replaying this exile story, or this they did this to us, like, this is before Haman, this is kind of who we are. We're the crushed people, and which is that's the chip on my shoulder. I don't want to be be carrying that around, and feeling like, okay, I'm living roughly, I'm 75 years after the re-sovereigning of the state of Israel, and he's maybe, if he's a few generations or whatever, a couple generations, the way this is given here, that he has this maybe that's kind of how he is too, like when's he going to stop thinking about himself in those terms, and that all he can say to Esther is apparently like, don't talk about this to, you've got nothing good, maybe you can escape that, but like those are the option A and the
Right,
option
right.
B.
And he hangs around the gates, right? This is not someone who's going off to work, or he's pacing the gates. Unclear if that's because he's trading in secrets or whether he's a beggar, but different commentators have different reasons placing him at the gates. Obviously, it puts him in an opportune moment so that by chapter 3, he's used his hanging out at the gates to let the king know that someone was plotting to kill him. But still, he's hanging around the gates. Who hangs around the gates of the castle all day and kind of either gossips, trades in secrets, or just paces back and forth? And then in chapter 3, refuses to actually follow through and behave in a civilized manner the way everybody else does, and sticks to his ground and says, I don't bow to people.
Now, you said, oh yeah.
No, I'm just thinking of what you were saying and thinking like, I'm torn between having respect for him and saying, get over it. Like, those days passed and now you're living out here in what's the gut, right? You're a refugee, and some assimilation is always appropriate.
Now, you were talking about Esther Hadassah, as someone who maybe navigates this in a more adjusted fashion.
Right.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, like, do you read it? Do you read into the lines that she might have in some way, pushed back against his instructions or rolled her eyes or anything like that?
Well, it's clear in chapter 2, right, that Esther does not reveal who she is or where she's from, because that's what Mordecai instructed her. So she clearly has some he has some influence over her. But for a young woman to have walked into the kingdom and figured out how to catch the eye of the king, get his fancy, and become queen takes a tremendous amount of savvy. You have to be somebody who has some real understandings of people and politics to reach that level. Think of the Broadway show Six, and those 6 incredible women. Like, it's something formidable to be the wife, to be the queen, right? To be chosen by the king. And yet Mordecai does have some influence on her, which makes me think she's a really strong survivalist. And she understands these men in her life and the different roles they each play and how to sort it out and make sense of it. I think she's an incredibly strong person.
I'm noticing the way in which in this chapter she's described as not talking about either her nation or her homeland, and which is sadly resonating to me as I think about particularly the many college students I know for whom those are kind of 2 layers that other people are essentially the way other people are defining them, trying to define what it means to be in this nation and trying to yoke them to their homeland in very specific ways, and not getting to say. So I'm also very sympathetic to Esther for not having a kind of a slogan that she's ready made for this situation, which again we know she's about to be in when nobody's in that situation yet. And I think this is an interesting moment where she is on her way to becoming queen, and also the Haman situation hasn't happened yet.
Right. And this is where I come back to that, right? That storytelling, right? So chapter 3 that we're about to step into is this really terrifying moment where the whole world's about to implode and seemingly go up in flames. And it does feel very, very current, right? I don't know of a college student who hasn't come home from college and said to their parents, to their rabbi, to friends, like, in these places, I don't tell them I'm Jewish. Or of any college kid who right now wants more than ever to passionately be writing about their struggles with their Jewish identity, their struggles with the state of Israel, and silences themselves because of fear of what their professors are going to do and how they might be graded. That is chapter 3.
Yeah.
That escalating tension, everyone is against you. There's a time and a date for it. It's been sent out to 127 nations to have a, the UN is all on the same page out against you.
Mm.
But the difference is, right, it's the Book of Esther, right? They're writing it intentionally to get a rise out of us.
Mm.
So are they doing a really great job of capturing our lived experience? Because that's not supposedly how fairy tales work.
You think they're meant to push us in a particular direction?
Right? I think they're supposed to be extreme, right? They're supposed to exaggerate things, and we should never have a lived experience that feels like it's right out of that fairy tale, because the whole point is literature is fiction. Which, by the way, foreshadowing is the only way I make sense out of chapter 9, kind of from a humanitarian perspective, but also not as a commandment. But right now, chapter 3 doesn't feel so fictional.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the hard chapter.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I think about the cusp of it as well. Actually, it's hard for me actually anymore, probably to, or at the moment, to see chapter 2, to see Esther disappearing, into the harem and into the king's orbit. uh, it's hard to see that, not in light of what's happening now, I guess. But also, I'm thinking about, if it really is already, if the Haman phenomenon is something which is just, it was there, and people, it was in whispers, and this just sort of blew it out into the open, and she was aware of that, then, part of the dilemma now, I'm, again, reading in, about some of the college students that I know the most, of this sense of, I don't want to just say one thing or the other, which side are you on, the Mordechai side or the Haman side? And since I can't talk about that, I might as well just not talk about, at certain times, not openly, where my Jewish situation at all. So I might as well just think about ways to make myself up, so to speak, in order to not have to do that, and or to bide my time, I guess, while things play out. So
So that
yeah,
biding
yeah.
time, that's chapter 4, right?
Mm.
Right. Chapter 3, Esther does disappear and it seems to not know what's going on. I mean, to some extent, there is a metaphor that we do have. Um, we don't have consensus in the Jewish community. There are people who don't have the same sense of foreboding. There are some people who don't, um, who see this as something that we have brought on ourselves. And there are some people who I think agree with us, John, about our feelings around this being really what others are doing to us. Chapter 4, Esther comes back. She comes back and she's like, what is going on, right? Why is Mordecai walking around like doomsday? And I can only imagine she's in the kingdom. She is queen. She thought she had gotten there. And I look around at
Mm.
people who have been so successful at code switching that in their Jewishness, they've reached places that we didn't think Jews might be, and have felt like we're okay. And I feel like it's not just for Jews, it's all minoritized communities. When you reach certain moments, you think, oh, well, this is a watershed moment, only to turn around and see the next day's events and realize, well, society hasn't actually caught up to that. The justice is not really there yet. It's just an exemplar. And chapter 4 is where that smacks up to reality, and Esther has to make the choice of, am I queen or am I Jewish queen?
Mm. Mm.
And we were, we both came of age, right, with the teenage, high schooly 80s activities. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American?
Mm-hmm.
And for the last 25 years, we haven't played in any of that. We've had intersectionality. We've had identifications. That question seems to come up in chapter 4
Mm.
to Esther. Are you the Persian queen or are you the Jewish Persian queen?
Mm.
And she answers it. And to me, I don't know how we get through chapter 4 at Megillah reading without
Mm.
just bursting into tears.
Mm.
When she is ready to say, I might lose my life over this. And I see the images of the kids at the Nova Music Festival. Anar, who grabbed those grenades and like lopped them back out of the migonit, of the safety space, concrete room they were all hiding in order to save everyone, time and time again, until just the timing was off and he was killed by a grenade that went off, and he saved everyone else along the way. Like, that's Esther of chapter 4.
Mm. Mm.
The women, 16 of them that are still in Gaza, and their mothers who went to the Red Cross and said, will you at least bring them abortion pills? Because we know they're being raped and at least they shouldn't have to be pregnant. That's chapter 4. And I don't know how we get through chapter 4. Probably more so than getting through chapter 9. For me, it's just the notion that you might have to think that your life is at risk by saying, hi, I'm a Jew. That's chapter 4. And we don't change the trope there until she says the end of it, right? At the end of that sentence, she says, V'chasher avadati avadati. And that's when we go into Eicha trope. But the rest of it, where she says, this is what I'm doing, I'm going to fast. This is why we have a Ta'anit Esther. We're in Megillah, Purim Megillah trope until the last 3 words. And if I perish, I perish. And it is the same trope that we use to describe the destruction of the temple, is how she self-describes her death.
What I've been hanging on to there at the end of chapter 4 is, I think, 2 things that my wish is for them to mean something different. One is that when Mordecai summons her and tries to summon her out and say, that this is your time, that you have to act. This is why this might be Miodea, who knows? This might be why you're the queen right now. That he also says this thing that sounds like it's a certainty. Also, he says, like, either you're going to do something or someone else is going to do something. Like I seem to know that someone is going to, that there's going to be a rescue or something that's going to come from somewhere. And it's making me think that like, I don't know where that faith comes from, or if he's just faking that and saying, like, it would be better, like, all in all, this situation is gonna get solved. It would be better if you solved it, if we solved it, than if somebody else, than if we push this off onto someone else. I don't know if he means another Jew, another, I have no idea what at all he means. And then she looks around, and while she asks that all the Jews fast, she also says, and I and my maidens, whatever, my entourage, we're gonna fast too. Like, she has this notion that these other girls who are not Jewish and have nothing to do with her that she's gonna be able to rally them around, and she's gonna be able to draw them toward her, which is, I think, again, and either that's just a gamble, or or maybe she has some understanding that she has developed this thing with the this basis, I don't know, for understanding with them. I assume she's going to have to tell them why she wants them to fast for 3 days. I mean, and why would they do that, unless she's making up some story, even.
Unless she's not, right?
Yeah.
She doesn't tell the king till after the 3 days. So she has 3 more days of power as the queen of Persia. And they'll do whatever they need her to do.
You're saying that these her retinue, that if she tells them to fast, they'll fast because she's the queen, like, no question.
Just because she's the queen.
Just because she's the queen.
Right? They come, they go, they do her bidding. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that verse either, of Mordecai kind of saying, well, if you don't step up, something else will happen and you're still going to die. Whether that means we're all in it together
Hmm.
and you're our last chance, or if someone else redeems us, they're not going to let you off the hook and you're going to go down because you didn't make that right move. Um, I think it's pretty amazing that he has no plan. He thinks she'll have a plan.
Hmm.
I mean, that is just makes me think of the Tatspitania, the over the what is the English for that role in the army? The not onlookers, but the surveyors,
Hmm.
the young women who really were the front line on October 7th
Hmm. Hmm.
and who were sending word. I think today there was just a demonstration of their parents and their memory, calling out to the government to really be accountable for why nobody believed these girls.
Hmm.
And there is in chapter 4 something incredibly powerful about the voice of women, the leadership of women, and there's a calm. Mordecai in all of the Book of Esther constantly seems to me to have too much energy.
Hmm.
He's pacing, he's coming, he's going, he's doing, like there's always chaos around Mordecai in this book. And whenever Esther comes into the story, I feel this sense of calm and centering,
Hmm.
that she gathers herself. She is not in a rush. It's going to take 3 days.
Hmm.
Children takes 24 hours. Like there's no hurrying this. So everyone's going to just have to slow it down now, come back to the table, wait for her. Again, this year more than any, I have grown in my respect of Esther and
Hmm.
in the leadership she evidences and in the ways that she has characteristics of leadership that we don't recognize, I think, in other times
Hmm.
and value in the same way. She's cunning and she is sharp. And Mordecai maybe plays chess and anticipates the next move, but she sees 5 moves ahead
Hmm.
and is planning for those. So while he's like, just tell the king, she's figuring out how to tell the king, get Haman in trouble, keep herself alive, and save the people. That's a big deal.
Yeah. I'm realizing how much there's two sort of parallel realities right now that seem like the crisis. I mean, whatever that are the crisis. The real crisis obviously is in Israel and in Gaza. That's where the most lives are at stake and have been lost already, and the certainty of that continuing with every day that the war goes on. And there, as an American here, I don't know how to speak to that and how one deals with the impossible calculations of trying to figure out what it means to be the queen, so to speak, and figure out when to, which moves to make and what's the diplomacy that's going to lead to this or that in real time. I feel like the other one, which is the one that American Jews are dealing with, and particularly young American Jews, is not like this, in the sense that it's not life or death today, and certainly the things that are happening in the discourse around Israel Palestine are not going to be solved. They didn't happen. They didn't just unleash on October 7th, and they're not certainly not going to be solved in a few days, or sadly, in a semester or an academic year. And so in that sense, I don't know how to map. I don't know exactly how to map. I have been thinking, though, in the sort of in the first realm about. I've just been seeing this year, I think in the last couple of weeks, something different in the statement of Mordecai's about what it means for you to act, or us to act as Jews, rather than letting someone else do this, and looking about the interrelationship between the Israeli government and President Biden, or the American Jewish community and the president. And I think that I've been really sitting for most of the war with something that happened at a meeting at our federation, probably about 10 days into the war, with Senator Hassan. Maggie Hassan is our one of our U.S. senators in New Hampshire, and she is a real friend of the Jewish community and very knowledgeable about foreign affairs. We're very, very lucky to have representatives who are kind of, you know, really immersed in foreign affairs, and who are and also just kind of who know our state. We're lucky that it's sort of small enough that there's the possibility that our statewide officials, you know kind of people everywhere. And very early on, she said to us that what she imagined is that Israelis would have to react, you know, how could they not, out of the out of the grief and the intensity of the emotion of the moment, and react with a forceful military response, and to expect for there to be some kind of perspective, you know, about the impact of that, you know, medium term or long term, would be too much. And that's why, fortunately, you have these friends who are the American government, for us to say the things that you couldn't possibly say, or that they couldn't possibly say, you know, I guess, thinking about Israelis. And on the one hand, I thought, you know, that's a tremendous gift to have friends like that who can sort of do for you in that way, and who can give you relief and deliverance, so to speak, from another place, to use the language of the text. But I am now also thinking that the downside of that is that you know, it's the loss of the moral voice, that if somebody else becomes that voice, and we don't, and that we might end up sort of solving the crisis in the right way, but we ourselves won't have been the ones who brought the right voice to it. And that's the fear that I have, and something I'm hearing in Mordechai's words in a certain way also. And then I hear him saying that that, you know, you've achieved power. Don't only think of yourself as we're in this total danger in this situation. You actually have malchut. You have royalty. You know, so yeah, you can see that as totally at risk, which is, I think, what American Jews, you know, still do. Typically, we don't believe how much power we have, and then we go right to, well, we don't have it, but actually we do. You know, in how much of it, again, it is certainly uncertain how we're gonna play it out.
Maybe this is maybe we're having a really good, like, taking on personas here, because I actually feel like Esther is saying to Mordecai, you're too tunnel vision here. Like, your moral vision here is not going far enough. You're just trying to solve for tomorrow, and I'm trying to solve for a longer term. And perhaps that is part of our challenge right now, both in our American society and with our Israeli, with the world's reaction to Israeli activities, military activities in particular. And that maybe Esther's perspective of, you know what, people take 3 days, and maybe that's take 3 months, and maybe that's, you know, slow down on, you know, jumping immediately to criticize, because there's a bigger picture. I think of this issue of privilege and power for Jews in the US and the rising anti-Semitism. And while it is true that we are not in imminent danger of death tomorrow, I do think that the landscape's changed overnight. More and more colleagues who just cannot get jobs because their profiles evidence their passion, whether it's for Israel or for Jewish causes, unclear. Certainly, school assignments and higher education in particular, K-12 and higher ed assignments that students have to confront that have strong biases that were there in the past, but they were in sort of small Christian-led schools for the most part, not in Brooklyn, New York. But now in Brooklyn, New York, in the public schools, you really don't want to walk in wearing a Star of David. And that's a pretty big generalization, but does not feel inaccurate from the circles that I work in and the people that I talk to about their workplaces.
Yeah.
Including in Long Island recently, somebody was hired and someone else in their district expressed surprise that that individual as a Jew would be hired at this moment in time, because of the Muslim forces that had been speaking up in that district and just wanting to avoid the conflict by avoiding such a hire. So I think a lot about the 1950s and the 1960s and the way the Jewish community in the US in particular created spaces for Jews to be equally successful because we couldn't get into mainstream, right? So we had JCCs because we couldn't get into the country club, and we created Jewish hospitals, and we had a medical school at YU because there was a quota. I don't think we're there again, but I certainly don't think we're in the golden age of, 2002, when Bob Chazin, Zichrono Livracha, used to talk about how Jewish studies in the non-sectarian world of higher ed was flourishing. I don't think that's the case. So what is chapters 4, but also really what are chapters 5 and 6? And Esther's way of handling both the king and Haman. Is there some sense of, this is just a story, but it's a story I can be proud of? I don't know. Or is
So
it just a story?
yeah.
And she might be my heroine because it's a dark day and I have a dark cloud over my head. But I'm never going to behave like that in real life, because in real life, princesses wear other capes. I don't know. I don't know.
Can we hop back to chapter 3? I think it's interesting that we have left over it. And chapter 3 is when Haman comes on the scene, and
Yes.
there's the direct part of it, which is this confrontation, which at least at the beginning seems very personal, about this newly empowered imperial official, and then this guy whoever he is, whoever Mordechai is seen to be, who's understood to be a Jew, and who's there's that, and then there's how he goes and how Haman articulates this to the king without calling it about the Jews at all, without naming the Jews, and this just chilling description of what it is about this people, this Am Echad, this one nation among the many of the king's empire, who are they're spread out everywhere, they're different from everybody else, and they don't follow the same laws, I guess, the king's laws. So he says, and and it it echoes the fears of Pharaoh, about having this non-indigenous people who he is afraid of in there. But I think it's understood in the Torah that the Jews aren't really meant to be part of Egypt in a long-term way. And here, something different is being said, but it's also not being said directly. I mean, there's something very direct about this and something very indirect. And so obviously this idea that there are these groups of plotters who, it's very easy to map this onto the Middle East and say people, okay, well, this is a group of people who are situated in our land, and they totally don't belong. They don't fit with the ethos, with the scheme, with the rules of the game around here. So there's nothing to do but to throw them into the sea. That part completely maps. The diaspora part, I'm trying to sort of work out how it maps. Certainly the part about being diffuse among all the peoples and all the states, so to speak. But is the Haman picture speaking to us, or is it speaking to you as an American Jew right now?
So I guess I skip over that part because I think it's just one of many ways in which we hear anti-Judaism described, right? Like, I don't actually sit on its particularities and say, oh, yes, that's the way that they come after us. No, it's one of the ways they come after us. They call us this, they call us that. We're here, we're not here, right? In the sum totality of the Book of Esther, there's 3 or 4 different ways in which Jews are hated. We don't follow rules. We're spread out. We're instigators. We're liars, because then he, gets angry about Esther when he realizes she is Jewish. So the only thing I'm thinking about as I'm reading it is much of this is that tension between Mordecai and Esther, right? How much of this is that story again, like that we have to retain or reject, the tension between retaining and rejecting our Jewish identity, So is this an internal critique or an external threat?
You say meaning
Like as a literary
ah,
tool, as a literary tool.
you think the
Is this
Megillah
the
might be
author is
yeah.
toying with us
Hmm,
and being like, listen, if you assimilate too much, you still can't get away from it.
hmm,
So you can be a little bit less like Esther and a little bit more like Morty.
hmm.
Or is it literally like, yes, you're out there, you're assimilating, you feel successful. And is this like a tochecha of the like, the Tresar Nevi'im, like at the end there, like, oh, you Jews, you're just intermarrying and you're going out there and you're eating trefa and you've forgotten where you come from.
Hmm, hmm,
But it definitely feels to me like a literary tool. I
hmm.
just, I don't have a handle for myself and therefore just don't know if I can even pinpoint if I were trying to teach it as a literary tool, like who's guilting whom about what.
Hmm, hmm. And so you're talking about that as rather than seeing from the inside so much of the story as to what's going on there, more as us, the audience, the whoever, the Jews, the diaspora Jews,
The
possibly
readers, right?
the readers, yeah, who are
Yeah.
looking at this, yeah. Huh.
Yeah. Because ultimately, like we knew there had to be a way that Haman was going to come after us. That's the whole point of the story.
Well, and then Achashverosh is the you
He's
know
just a doofus, right?
he's the doofus, but he's the in a way he's the bigger worry. We know what to do, about the Hamans. We know how to point at them, and eventually, that's what happens. And then there's this decision, which is to essentially to let Achashverosh off the hook and to draft him, to our cause, or to see it as necessary to make him our ally. It's his power that has to be part of the picture in order for us to complete to complete the reversal of Haman's plan.
So
And
Hashverosh is the wizard. And by the end of the Book of Esther, the curtain comes down and we see him for who he is.
hmm.
Right? He gets, for lack of a better term, undressed rather early in this book.
But he's scary, for that way, and having him kind of continue to be king is scary too. You were saying I sidetracked you. You were talking then about after, once Esther decides to snap into action, how she does that and what that says. Do you want to say something about that before we get
I
to
was
the
jumping in.
yeah
I was jumping us ahead a little bit. Chapters 5, chapter 6, right? Where I just think it's a very fun interplay. It's a moment in which I feel less emotional baggage, right? It's just like, what's our survival story here?
mm,
And it moves rather quickly, right? Esther kind of kissing up to the king and softening him, and at the same time, also getting Mordecai finally recognized
mm,
for his saving the king's life, which I think is part of that softening up. Like, if nothing else, parading Mordecai around and Haman being the person who has to parade him around the town and like this is who the king loves. Like if that is not every op-ed being written today about how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, I don't know what other analogy to make, right?
mm, mm,
And it is our natural, we acclimate, we're good at it as Jews. We do know how to fit in. We are really good at survival. It's what we do. And clearly we've had this talent throughout our DNA. This is our origin story of our survival of assimilation, chapter 6, and that parading, that moment of glory for Mordecai. Even when the stakes are that we're about to lose everything, we still have that moment until, Esther really finally puts her neck out and right, and now I've already jumped us all the way to chapter 7.
no, go for it, yeah.
Right, so chapter 7, when she finally is able to say he did this, he is the person that did this. And chapter 7 and the last 3 verses of it, where the king's people say to the king, oh, Haman was about to eradicate all of the Jews. He was going to kill them all. He has the noose waiting for Mordecai's neck at the top of this tall tree in his backyard. It is clear that all his agenda has been violence. And this, I think, is the poetic moment and why it feels so hard to go and read the end of chapter 8, because the hostages haven't come home. That miracle hasn't happened for us in Israel yet. We haven't figured out how to hold the largest violent killing of Jews since World War II and have a last verse of chapter 8 of what's the moment that's closure on that. But in chapter 8, that's their moment, is this kind of poetic justice. You meant for it to be for Mordecai. Instead, this will be your fate, Haman. And I don't think it's meant to be a literal, we're supposed to now hang our enemies but on a tree. I think it's supposed to be a moral sense of we figure out our way to have closure and say, Ad Khan, they cannot hurt us.
So we should really spell.
How do we do that? Like, how do we do that when there's still hostages? We can't. We don't have an ending yet. And that, I think, is why reading chapters 8, 9, and 10 are so hard to me right now.
Yeah, it is. I think so. We should I think spell out to just sort of flesh out the picture that there is this. So there is the there is the part that we teach always to our kids, which is that Haman gets his comeuppance. He's the one who gets hanged, and then of course we decidedly don't read the rest of the story. Certainly probably to the young kids. I mean, I certainly never read it till I was farther along, quite far along, probably into my adult life, where there is this. I think what I was taught when I was young was that there was for whatever reason the king couldn't just rescind this order to kill the Jews, but gave the Jews the right to defend themselves, so he defended themselves. But the text obviously says there was more than that. There was quite a quite a lot of violence, back to the point that people were afraid to not be seen as Jewish. They were afraid that appearing not to be Jewish was dangerous to them, and a huge number of people who were killed. And these are very not literary chapters as much as the early chapters are so carefully written. This seems to be just kind of spewing out there in a lot of ways. And so I think we have these twin things, which is the sense of there's not closure. I mean, I think about it seems to me that the first Gulf War, the culmination ended right around Purim, the fall of Saddam Hussein, or whatever, not the fall, but the defeat in Kuwait. And there was this great sense of this is how it happens. Here it was in Mesopotamia, that the exact place that the exact tying up of tying everything up into a bow, militarily and ethically. So there is that. But then there's this other thing of is the only response, is this the response we're recommending, as you were saying before, that this would be the it's not enough to just neutralize Haman. It's not enough to get rid of his little gang, but anybody possibly who was possibly going to participate in the his allies, his outer circle, anybody who we could say is possibly complicit in any way, needs to be killed. And that becomes the moral dilemma that I know I'm thinking about. I'm certainly not the only one thinking about. And also the binariness even on this side, that your only choice is to justify that kind of response, and not to say wait a minute, in any possible way about that.
So this is where I go back to this artifact on the website of Yad Vashem of a Megillah, and where in chapter 9 there are the names of the sons of Haman, who are known collaborators in the story and who get in the story, this literary punishment captures them up in it as well, and where they've inserted the names of Hitler and Mussolini and other leaders in Hitler's army as their chapter 9. And this is I believe the Megillah was from Casablanca, 1944, or something. I could be wrong. Yad Vashem will, I'm sure, correct us. So if this were post-Germany, and we were reading the Megillah, and that was how we represented Haman, that would feel, I think, fun. Like, I'm not sure we'd have this moral equivalence. Like, I don't know that we'd be struggling with who is our enemy and what is the consequence to their actions. And I think if we were only talking about Hamas, many of us would feel very different. And so I think the challenge of chapters 8, 9 of the Book of Esther is not what happens there, but who are we imagining our enemy is?
You think of it as who are we imagining our enemies, as opposed to how are we imagining ourselves in response to
how are we imagining ourselves? Because I do think the Book of Esther says there are times you have enemies who are going to be out there to get you, and that there's certainly a fantasy. Again, I'm reading this as literary fantasy. I'm not reading this as prescriptions. This is not go self-defend, here's how you kill people. It's okay to feel angry and mad and imagine retribution, because it's a story and it's fictional. But I don't even think I know who the enemy is to imagine it about. And that to me is the challenge. Like, I know it's Hamas, but who is Hamas these days?
Yeah.
Is it just the leadership in the tunnels? Is it the families that have been holding hostages in their private homes in Gaza? Is it the UN who's been hiding them in the hospital? Like, who is Haman and the Hamonim, the many people out there that he managed to convince to hate the Jews? What am I fantasizing about succeeding to overcome?
Yeah. And I think the question of whether, if it was so easy to take these, neutral people and turn them into the people who are going to execute this decree against the Jews, who really, you could say in chapter 3 they weren't into it. It's like, okay, that's a thing, that's a law now, we're going to do that.
Right.
Now there's another law, we're not going to do that, and which in some way is the question about Germans after World War II. There was no, we had, what I thought you were going to say about the Casablanca Megillah was that, there were war crimes trials, and there was sort of a civilized process of, not to say that there weren't, acts of,
and maybe that is what chapter 9 is. To us it's not, because in our day and age, but in fact, like, the king ordered this activity to happen. That is actually what a war crime trial would be like. In some. But again, what I'm most concerned about is when we read this and we think that we're literally talking about going out and killing all the Hamans, which I don't think is the point of the story.
You don't think?
The point of the story is emotional release, that we deserve to have emotional release in our lives and not have to carry the anger and the shame and the burden of living in an anti-Semitic world and think that we can't fantasize about it getting better. We can. And sometimes we have dark fantasies, but we don't act on them. That's what being mature humans is about. You don't act out on them. You talk about them and you make fun of them and you have a carnival and you masquerade, and then you put it away and you go back to the table to be mature, rational beings. I think that's the message of chapter 10. Once you're done, do the right thing. Feed the people who are hungry. Take care of each other. Find your friends, build partnerships.
Yeah. I think that, the fear is that there are two fears, I think. One is that there are groups of Jews who take it very literally, and they are represented in the Israeli government, and they
definitely,
and absolutely. And I don't know that we have to elaborate too much to say that, at least,
except to say radicalizing religion is bad, period.
Yeah. And I think the other fear is that I see in the last chapter there is this sense of, when we look back on it, what are we going to say happened, and what are we going to say about ourselves? And so I see, Esther and Mordechai write these letters, particularly the latter one, which describes how this is going to be observed and remembered as a turnabout from miagon l'simcha, from mourning to joy, and introducing this out of nowhere thing about mishloach manot and matanot le'evyonim, that we're gonna send meals to each other, and we're going to take care, as you say, of those most in need. And there was a part, when I wrote my article in college, I said, I sort of went back to what I thought was Mordechai's religion of almost no religion, and thinking of like that the Jews go back in this sense to like having no religion except kind of liberal values, do advocate for general, do particular things that are kind of socially beneficial, and right, there's no recognition in this telling of in this sort of prescription. There's no thing in which they say, remember, this started with a Jew standing up and saying, I won't bow down, I only bow to God. So that was one of my worries, was that this was a way of saying, let me offer you kind of a secular Judaism that you can land back on after all of this. But I lately have been thinking much more that this is again a fear that that when it's over, and again and I very much am in this moment of it's not over, so who knows, but that if it becomes over, that we would say, okay, what happened was the most satisfying thing, where we got to kill all our enemies and get rid of every last one of them, and intimidate the king into letting us have these positions of power. And Esther saying, okay, that's not what I want the legacy to be. I understand that that's how it's going to feel, for a period of time, but I want us to tell this as a story that this incident itself mandates that we go back into this mishloach, like matanot le'evyonim. There is a mitzvah to give tzedakah. That's already a thing. Mishloach manot, cementing our relationships on a deeper level, is not, in some ways, is a new mitzvah that she invents, in the same way that even having this holiday at all is something that she invents. And I'm very taken with this notion in the Midrash that this is when the covenant is kind of like firmly established, and that it's in the wake of this diaspora story, but that is very much about that. So I feel like what I want the story to say, what I want it to mean, is Esther telling us, like, I stepped into this situation, I stood up for us, I did this not allow, whatever, I orchestrated what I orchestrated. I got us into a position where we could be, not only we saved our lives, but we kind of established ourselves in this kingdom as really as important, not just as one of the other 127 nations, but that we have kind of a moral value here that we're able to display, and but also that we know how to have power and use it. And this is my fantasy about the end, I guess. I don't know.
Well, and Mordecai's way of doing it wasn't enough, right? The Megillah says at the end of chapter 9, yeah, Mordecai wrote a letter, that's nice, but Esther's letter is the letter that mattered. What did Esther do?
So how do you see,
right? What did Esther do?
Yeah.
Esther cemented relationships. She forged strong relationships in the kingdom. She cemented some relationship, whether it was a relationship of love or lust or friendship and partnership with the king. But she cemented something that Ahasuerus trusted her, relied on her, looked after her. That was Esther's slow, thoughtful intentionality, right? She was not Mordecai, who was aggravating and acting out. She was methodical. She was intentional. She took her time. She had more than one opportunity. So she was very political. She was nurturing, and she was socializing everybody to the new situation, evidencing for them with data what they were seeing, and then allowing them to come to the conclusions of what action should be taken by directing them in the right way, kind of opening the door so they could see what was in front of them without actually saying, this is what you need to do. And was able to say in the end, I actually never asked for anyone to be killed. That was the king acting harshly on his own spontaneous energy. She never once asks for revenge. She only says, here are the facts of what they've done. And then he sends outside reporters who come back and say, oh my God, it's what she's telling you isn't even the beginning of it. Like, look at what he built. And the king gets mad and again acts spontaneously. He doesn't wait and thoughtfully consider his options. He sends off an edict. And then she comes back and says, wait, there's other cleaning up you need to do. Look at this political mess that's been left behind. And again, she points him down the right direction, and he's the one that. So I think there's a majestic upper hand of leadership in the ways in which Esther stays above it all, and a reminder that we can stay above it all, that we can look and see what the right direction is and let the world play out in its minutia and hold to our moral voice and moral ground. She creates a fast day that never existed. She creates mitzvot to be observed around a holiday that had never existed. For a woman to have that kind of an imprint on Jewish ritual practice, quite amazing, given kind of the era within which that evolves, and that they are beholden to her for that is fascinating. And they end it with this notion that, like, there's a way to move from mourning to joy. And that's where I land. They could figure it out. In the Holocaust, they could figure it out. In the 1948 war, they could figure it out. And this is devastating. And part of this is our privilege that we haven't had to think of ourselves as victims in a long time. But we can own the language of it and not let it hold us back. We can somehow still be us.
I'm going to, if we were in the process of recording, I'd be pushing rewind to listen to all of what you just said the last few minutes. That should be the thing that we all listen to for sure. I am, among the many things in what you said, I'm struck by you're talking about it not just being one decision to make, and because that's also one of my worries about us as Jews sort of generally, is to see this as kind of as sort of boiling down to one thing, which is the how do we get them to be for us as opposed to against us, and that there's more. It looks different at different moments. It looked different in October. It looked different in December. It looks different now. It will look different after, God willing, the war is over. You know, whether it's the first day after
It's going to look different at Seder.
Yeah, yeah.
It's going to look different on Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah. And then there's hopefully a lot of redemption coming to us.
Well, we've been talking for a long time, and that sounds like the best way to finish.
I think we need to end. Yes.
Karen, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Ooh, this was a lot.
We hope that this conversation will be valuable and perhaps at least soothing. It was certainly intense and meaty, and we will share how to reach us too, so that if there are things you want to wonder what either of us have to say, I would say particularly Karen, you should send notes, or and in the various places this will be posted, you know, push comments, and know also that we are hardly the only two rabbis in the world who are having this exact conversation, and if you have a rabbi that you feel you want to talk to about any of these things that we've been talking about, they would, I think, they would not only relish the opportunity, but I think they'd find it really comforting to know that these are the things that members of our community are thinking about. So I will wish you a Simchat Purim early, Karen, and
to you as well. Some call for Tanit Esther, and Besorot Tovot, we hope.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Bye.
All right. Thank you. Good night.